Who is this stranger you only saw once, but still think about sometimes? Went to an open studios show. The sort where you go to different artists' houses and see how where they work. This one artist had an easel set up with a half-done picture of a flower. But her model. The flower had wilted. Guess I wasn't fast enough. Again. She said. Laughing. She was swinging up a rubber chicken and dancing around the room. And somehow, we ended up doing dueling Carl Sagan voice impressions. Billions and billions. At the end my GF was trying to drag me out of there and the artist's friends were trying to get her to settle down. Neither of us wanted to. It is nothing special. But it is the most fascinating and remarkable moment I had. I was like 13 or 14 years old and was in London as a tourist in the summer holidays. Me and my family were on a boat trip on the River Thames. It was a really nice day. Perfect weather. We were sitting on top of the boat so we could see everything. So, just as we were passing through the Tower Bridge, I saw a woman. Or maybe it was a girl, she was older than me anyway. She wore sunglasses and seemed to be from an Asian country. I assume Japan. She waved down at us. I raised my hand and waved back. As she realized that I was waving back, she seemed to start laughing and looked really happy. Of course I couldn't hear her laughing. But I could see her. Then the boat crossed the bridge and we lost line of sight. This moment is not special at all. Yet I still think about it sometimes. When I was 9 years old, I went to Walmart with my dad. So we're standing in line at the checkout and a couple of pennies fall out of the coat pocket of the guy in front of us. I remember that he was an elderly black guy. Because I grew up in rural New England and didn't know many people of color. So I reached down and picked them up. Because I'm a little kid who thinks 3 pennies are a significant loss. And I'm really nervous because I don't like talking to strangers. But I got his attention and said, "Sir, you dropped this." And I gave him the pennies back. And he said, "Oh. Thank you. But you know what? I also dropped this and this saw," and he literally starts taking f-king handfuls of change out of his coat pockets. Like. He leaves this huge pile of coins on the conveyor belt. And he gives the whole thing to me. I've never broken my childhood piggy bank, but let me tell you. Something like half of the coins in there were from that one guy. I have no idea who he was or why he decided to give me all the change in his pockets. But it felt like one of those fairy tales where the good witch disguises herself as an old person who needs help to secretly test people's characters and reward good deeds. An insanely old lady walking down the road. Her back was so crooked it looked like she was bent 90 degrees at the waist. She stopped next to a park, pulled out a carton of eggs and started throwing them at the pigeons. I feel that was an essential formative experience for me. Why should they be happy? Double quote. Edit. Thanks for the votes of confidence, guys. I really didn't mean it to be as funny as it was from the show. When I heard the line from Ted, I laughed because it was great humor thinly veiling sadness. I tried to convey that desperation. But I think that realistic, pessimistic even, of you may have been lost. Sorry to be a downer. And again, thanks. Remember to love your pigeons and old folks. An old guy who was in the hospital bed opposite my dad. He was in a bad way and his wife and daughter were visiting him. Sat for a couple of hours watching them look after him while he was coughing tea up and helping him drink water through a straw from one of those little plastic cups you get in hospital. The daughter, who had come up from London, was telling them about her kid who was learning about dinosaurs and would talk for ages about them. Didn't speak to them but shared a kind of sad smile with the daughter, who looked pretty distraught by it all. Came to visit the next day and my dad told me he had a heart attack in the middle of the night and was moved to an intensive care ward. Never found out what happened to him. But I still hope that he got better and that he got to see his grandkid again and talk about dinosaurs with him. This guy with a really cool half man half deer costume at the Ren Fair one year. Aside from the cool costume, he kept playing peekaboo with this little kid and making him scream and giggle. I don't know why he stuck out to me, but he seems like he would have been a cool dude. A kind stranger that gave me $2 so I didn't have to lose money by overpaying with a $10 bill to go fishing. My wife and I were outside an entrance to a camp fishing lake that was self-pay. It was $3 but I only had a $1 bill and a $10 bill. A stranger happened to walk up to pay for himself and his friend as I was telling my wife this and asking her if she had any ones. The stranger just said, "Here you go man," and handed me $2. The fish that day were not as generous though. Not a single fish was caught. I've told this story before, but this has definitely stuck with me for years. When I was a kid we didn't have a lot of money, so we often shopped at thrift stores. What I loved about that was that you could get 10 books for $1. So I would plant myself in front of the book section and make piles of which one I wanted to get and then decided after I'd gone through them all. One day an older lady saw me sitting with my piles and asked if I liked to read. I told her I did and showed her a few of the books I found that I liked. She smiled and then pulled $1 out of her purse, handed it to me and said, "Promise me that you'll keep reading." I was so happy and immediately stood up and said that I would. She smiled and walked away and I went back to my piles able to pick out an extra 10 books to take home. It was just a small act of kindness for her. But for me, having a random stranger encourage my love of reading and making me promise to never stop definitely had a lot to do with my continued love of reading. This was probably about 20 years or so ago. But I still think of her whenever I buy a new book. There were these two guys in front of me in line for the top thrill dragster at Cedar Point and I was pretty much freaking the FCK out because I was so scared. They launched the coaster one time and it didn't clear the hill and came back down. Normal thing that sometimes happen, but that scared me shitless. We had already been in line for like 2 hours so I couldn't back out now. The two guys in front of me started cracking jokes and just talking to me about random stuff to get my mind off how scared I was. Then they sat behind me and my friend on the ride and screamed like little girls. They were so awesome. I hope they're still out there cheering people up. I was in a small town, best known for a dinosaur museum, eating at a restaurant with a friend. This lady, who looked to be about in her 80s, came over and asked if it was our first time here. My friend shook his head no. I said yes. Then she stared at me and reached into the pocket of her jacket. She slapped a postcard on the table, welcomed me to the town and left. I think I still have that postcard in a drawer somewhere. I was sitting in a bus stop crying my eyes out because my fiance asked for the ring back. And this girl from the local high school sat down next to me to see if I was okay. She was really nice. And she gave me a big hug. And she just sat with me for ages with her arms around me while I cried on her shoulder. And basically blubbered all my problems at her. When I'd calmed down, she told me everything was going to be okay. And that it didn't matter if I was single or got back together with my fiance. Because she had faith that I was strong enough to handle anything life threw at me. And she was right. Every time my life feels hard, I remember her. And things don't feel so bad. Edit. If it matters to anyone, it was kind of a symbolic giving back of the ring. We did patch things up, but called it quits a few months later, amicably and for different reasons. I still have the ring, as well as both the wedding rings we had bought at the time. We were marrying the following year. We plan on making them into an alternative jewelry piece for our daughter when she's a bit older. We're now both dating our high school sweethearts. And we often joke that we were cosmic placeholders for each other while we learned the lessons we needed to have really strong relationships with the people we love now. So I was waiting in a line of traffic with my father for an air show. I was so excited that I had been smiling at and waving to random strangers for most of the drive. In the middle of a halted intersection, I saw a bearded man walking down the side of the road. I smiled and waved at him. He smiled and waved back. I'll never forget that delightful man. I was in Bergen with a friend doing a tour around Norway. We were in a park and this guy, curly hair, around 40 years old, smiled at us. The happiest, nicest, beautifulest smile of all. He walked away, and we turned to look at him. He was looking at us too. and waved at us. I like to imagine he is still smiling at people in this park and being happy. The one chick who ducked under the crossing guard blockade and leapt across the tracks mere seconds before the train came. She literally threw her entire body in the air and to the ground to avoid getting hit. Close bracket. I was once on a train that somebody jumped in front of to commit suicide. It was high speed and they died instantly. I had headphones in at the time and was zoned out. But when I realized we were at a stop for about 10 minutes, I asked my friend what was happening. The whole ordeal shook me at the time. Because something so monumental had happened, and not only did I not realize, but it was treated very routinely. We were out of the station in about an hour and a half. Edit. Some other people have commented with similar stories. So it's worth noting that I was in Germany at the time on vacation. And part of what I heard from other people on the train was that the reason people chose to jump in front of trains there is because they don't have access to other methods. Mainly guns. The cashier at Home Depot who told me to cheer up and how I was too young to look so sad, when I didn't feel in the least bit down and was simply looking around. I have an ugly face, so I've heard this comment more times than I can count. I can kinda get where he was coming from. My eyelids tend to look droopy and I have circles under my eyes no matter how much sleep I get. I also get this comment quite a lot. Had a long conversation one afternoon in Washington Square Park with an old man who saw me looking at pigeons and started talking to me about bird behavior. We wound up talking for like 3 or 4 hours and he was pretty wise and kind of eccentric. Never mentioned any family or anything. I never saw him again. I work at a library and a few months ago we were closing up and the supervisor found a man who had no legs in a wheelchair that had fallen asleep in the stacks. She politely woke him up and told him that we were closing in a few minutes and asked if we could call someone for him. He said he didn't have anyone and he basically refused to leave. This was the middle of winter in Iowa, so supervisor feels terrible about throwing him out and calls our director and the police to help him find a place to stay. Director shows up and tells the man that we have closed and that the police are on their way. At which point he decides that now he would like to leave. He leaves and wheels himself across the parking lot and out of sight, and of course then the police show up. Apparently this guy is basically a missing person and his family has been looking for him for months. The cop circles the neighborhood looking for him but he was gone and he never came back to the library. I just hope that he's okay. I was probably about 8 and in this daycare section of some church when I hit my knee on something. And I said ow because it hurt. And this guy with a mop just stops in the middle of the hallway and stares me dead in the eyes and says in this sadistic Donald Duck voice, "Oh, did you get a boo-boo?" and walks away. It was probably one of the most unsettling things I've experienced. I was a new cashier at a hardware store and this disheveled young guy came through my line buying a few cheap things like driveway markers and rope or something. Turned out he was deaf and when I tried to tell him the total he didn't hand me enough money. So I wrote it down on paper for him and he still didn't seem to be getting it. It was busy and we obviously had a communication issue and the people in line behind him were starting to get antsy annoyed. He had me remove a few items but still didn't have enough. Eventually he flipped over the paper I'd written numerous totals on and wrote simply "I'm sorry" and left with nothing. I still feel terrible about it and sometimes wonder if he's doing okay. The older gentleman who knocked on my door one day and asked if he could possibly come inside and revisit the home in which he had lived over 55 years ago. It was a pleasure to show him around and to hear his recollection of things that had happened within those walls many years ago, some of which were eye-openers. I never saw him again because he was visiting from the other coast, where he now lives. Still, he told me tales of the house and neighborhood I won't forget. This man in a Red Sox hat that I met on a Connect flight from Pittsburgh to California. We both forgot our neck pillow and decided to go with each other to buy some because a kiosk had a buy one, get one 50% sale. He ended up paying for mine too. I think about him every time I board a flight with that neck pillow. Sigh. A woman and I waiting in line at a Walgreens bathroom during the Boulder big ass race in my town. Made a pact to split the cost of a box of tampons. She was like my bestie for those 5 minutes and that was that. I don't think about her every time I use a tampon though, tbh. That'd be weird. I was eating at a restaurant seated at a window that looked out onto the main street. I saw an old man walk by after getting off his phone. Hand slowly covering his mouth. Breaking down into tears. He'd obviously heard some bad news. I still think of him and the situation he found himself in. I was sitting in an airport waiting for my flight when I suddenly heard a nearby woman shriek. She was still on her phone. She got up from her seat and was crying and started to run away. The guy she was with ran and grabbed her and said, "What? What?" Double quote. She said, "My kid's dead." Double quote. "What? Which one?" Double quote. "Sarah." Double quote. And they went off and I had to board my flight. I felt so bad for them and will always wonder what the story was. Was walking in Times Square about 15 years ago. A creepy guy was walking next to me for a long time saying super inappropriate things. Out of nowhere an older man came up to me and was like, "Susan, don't walk so fast. Mom and I didn't know where you went." That man saved me and walked me to work. I think about him often. Happened to me at a bar in Nashville. Was dancing with a guy for a minute or two and when I turned to go and find my friends, he grabbed me by the arm and yanked me back twice. Not so much that it hurt, but it was way more aggressive than called for. Another guy came out of nowhere and said, "There you are. We were looking for you," and led me away and walked with me till I found my friends. He probably thought nothing of it, but I was so happy and grateful to see that some guys are aware of that shit and willing to step in. Man in a purple suit at Walmart. Can still picture his face 2 decades later. My mom and I were going through the poorest stage of our lives. Deep poverty. After she divorced my abusive stepdad. Everything we ate was from a pantry or WIC. As we were picking up WIC food, I was crying because we hadn't eaten all day because it was a Saturday night. No free school food. We had dry rice and beans and some milk in the cart and it would be a couple hours before we ate said rice and beans. As we lived 45 minutes away, I was begging my mom, not in a loud or obnoxious way, to get something I could eat then. A man in a purple suit must have overheard. Handed my mom a $20 bill. I know she was embarrassed to take it, but had to for my sake. We got a hamburger each from the in-store McDonald's and used the rest for a couple more grocery essentials. I teared up thinking about him a couple weeks ago. Years ago, I went to water fire in Providence. RI. It's an event they hold along the river on some spring and summer nights. There are lots of fire torches lighting up the river and fire jugglers and other artists. I wasn't having a great night because all the wood smoke was making me feel sick. I was standing around, absent-mindedly gazing towards the river, when I suddenly made eye contact with this man. He was tall and probably around 30. He had long, messy blonde hair. He was with a girl. I don't know if it was his wife or girlfriend or a first date. I caught his eye right as she was leaning in to kiss him. I remember thinking that the look on his face was pure happiness, and how much I wanted to be with someone who could make me feel like that. I still think about him sometimes, and wonder what it felt like to be watched by a stranger in that moment. When I was younger taking the train with my dad, there was a couple sitting by us and the guy would do this thing with his mouth that would just scrunch up his lips to the side that made him look like he was thinking really hard about something. I've never seen anyone do this, but I thought it was cute and thought that if I had a boyfriend who did that I'd love it. Now it's a couple of years later and I have my first boyfriend. And he's the second person I've ever seen do something like this. I've never told him about this random guy, but I still think it's adorable and funny to think about. I was driving down a road in our very small town and passed a man with cardboard tied to his feet. I stopped and got out. Tried talking to him, but he mimed that he couldn't speak or see. He was tugging at something on his neck and whining. I told him I would help him if he put his stick down. He did. And I removed a car key tied around his neck and gave it to him. I tried to figure out where he was going, but he was very upset. He refused money multiple times. Then, bam. 4 cops spotlight us. I tried to tell them what was going on and how he wasn't a threat, but they made me leave. We have no mental health services or shelters close by. So I called the PD later to check on him. He wasn't arrested, despite being handcuffed and taken to the PD. The last update I got that night was that a local preacher took him in. I just hope he's okay, and wonder how he ended up in BFE. We have no public transportation of any sort. I think what got me the most was that he refused money repeatedly. He was just scared and mentally unstable. I hope he's with people who care for him now. When I was 8 or 9 years old, 20 years ago now, my family and I were vacationing on the Gulf side of Florida. My little sisters and I were playing on the beach and a young guy, mid-20s maybe, asked if we wanted to see something cool. He said he was studying marine biology and walked out into the ocean, dug around under the waves with his foot and went under for a second. He popped up with a huge starfish. He spent a few hours afterward showing us how to find them and teaching us all about starfish. He was so cool and I've never forgotten him after all these years. I saw a girl and she was wearing all purple. Purple dress and purple tights. Purple coat. Purple shoes. Purple coat. Purple umbrella. Even her hair was dyed purple. She looked like a real life anime character or something from a terrible teen fic. I lived in a really small town, so seeing somebody so noticeable that I'd never seen before was unusual. Never saw her again, and never met anybody who remembered seeing her. So weird. When I was suicidal, I disappeared without telling anyone for a few days, just driving and being alone. Anyhow, when I got home, I realized there were a few people concerned. Read. The police. My housing officer had been worried and led a police officer into my apartment. He waited off duty until I got back and he just hugged me and listened to me whilst I cried and told him my story. He left and I never saw him again. But he was the only person to make me feel somewhat human. I was run over when I was about 8. It was completely my fault. 100%. I'd love to somehow speak to the woman who was unfortunately the one whose car I ran in front of. I got straight back up, miraculously, and gave her a feeble thumbs up and ran away. If that was me now, it would have traumatized me for life. She has no way, considering this was about 1996, to know that I was completely okay. I think about her almost every time I cross a road. This was a few years ago and I can't remember the details, but I was carrying something with both my hands and this one guy must have noticed it because he stood by the door to which I was heading. It was the only way out of the place we were at, even though he could have just walked away because the gap between us was quite huge. But he stayed and held the door for me. On top of that, he gave me the most genuine smile I've ever received as I passed the door and thanked him. I just moved into my aunt's after she passed away. It was 3:30 PM and I had class at 5. I wanted to take a nap, so I sat down in my folding sports beach chair and reclined it all the way back, manually, by setting into the notch, and closed my eyes. Right when I was about to fall asleep, someone knocked on the door really loud. Eyes and contacts dry. I opened the door. It was an old lady who lived next door, welcoming me to the apartment complex. I still despise her for waking me up. I had issues. At my friend's hen bachelorette party, we had gone to Blackpool, seaside town in the UK. For those unfamiliar, for the weekend. The first night out we'd had a few cocktails and gone to a karaoke bar. My inhibitions lowered and feeling somewhat devil-may-care, I stepped up to the mic and belted out what was probably a pretty awful rendition of Whole Lotta Love, obviously. In my inebriated state, I was the next Robert Plant. Did my thing. Had a good laugh and went back to my group. Now, I'm a big girl. I'm not normally so outgoing or flamboyant in front of strangers as I was when I was channeling the Zep. In truth, self-confidence is something that is inherently missing from my personality, but I was out with my friends having a jolly good time. I wasn't looking for validation or any such bollocks. I didn't care A few moments after my performance, a guy comes over to where we're gathered and says to me, "You have a wonderful smile. You're a very beautiful woman. Don't ever lose that confidence. Great song choice." And he disappeared, never to be seen again. He gave me a much needed boost that I didn't know I needed at that point. He made me feel wonderful. I often wonder about him. I was walking from the bus stop to class in my campus. From far, I saw this small Asian girl with black hair walking diagonally with me. I barely saw her face, but I knew she was looking at me and smiling. The brightest smile I have ever seen. I smiled back but kept on walking, still confused. For 5s we maintained eye contact, which seemed like an eternity. She went into a building. I don't know why I still remember that smile until this day. I don't remember her face, her figure, but at that moment something just instant connect us together for that 5s. Something warm, welcome and safe. I still search for that smile till this day. I leave that to fate. The guy with the sad face. Perfectly happy person talking with his friend, laughing, having a good time. But his face, the literal facial structure behind it, was just sad looking. Droopy eyebrows, eye bags, all of it. Guy looked sad when he was happy. Why do I still think of him? Cause of that stupid post that jumps to the front page of Reddit every few months. How if you think happy you'll beam out and look happy and pleasant. Guy just looked sad. Doesn't mean he was. Thought we had moved past this weird 1800s physiognomy. I'm kinda cheating, because I saw this person twice. But here goes. I was on a humanitarian trip with my class in New York 2 years ago. Altogether, there were 10 people in our group. One night we were riding the subway, and we had to ask for directions. None of us had been to New York before, and none of us had really ridden the subway often. Being from a small town in Canada, one of the people in our group asked a happy looking lady which train we should get on to get to our destination. She happened to be on the same train as us. Our group talked to her for at least 20 minutes on the train, and she exchanged contact information with one of our leaders so we could meet again before our group left. We met her on our last day there, and it felt like we were saying goodbye to a longtime friend. She still is in contact with one of our leaders. She wished us a Merry Christmas recently. After we left, we found out she's an event planner and was in charge of decorating the big Macy's department store for Christmas, and was also in charge of a float for the Macy's parade. Just a very friendly person. She completely destroyed the stereotype that New Yorkers are rude. Went shopping over the border with my mother and saw the most beautiful black woman at the checkout. She had silver hair done in box braids sparsely decorated with beads that went down to her hips. Not a lick of makeup on her face. She was absolutely gorgeous. More so the way her face lit up with a smile while she was talking. She was taller than most women. Thin. Wearing a floor-length orange sundress. She had gold bangle bracelets on as well as many rings. Told the cashier she was turning 75 next month. I've never met someone who had aged as gracefully as the one woman I once saw in a Target checkout. A beautiful man came up to the till whilst I was working. He had that nice rugged look and I think he was a farmer. He bought like 4 huge bags of dog food for large working dogs. He picked up all these heavy bags like it was nothing. Flashed me a beautiful smile as he's hauling these bags up. He was super polite too. I was melting. Another stranger at this pet shop. He had a cute little white staffy puppy. This little guy was so well trained he didn't need a lead. He followed his owner so obediently around the shop. And when they left, the puppy walked round to his side of the car. Waited for the door to be opened, but hopped in. So cute. The bus driver in LA. I talked to him twice actually. I said good morning the first day, and asked him how he was doing in broken Spanish the next. He lit up. We talked the entire drive back to the hotel. About everything from Spanish to culture shock to baseball. Thought about him all night. Wrote him a note to give to him the next morning. But he wasn't working that day and I lost my nerve. That was my last day in the city. So I lost my chance. I still think about him a lot. And the what if I had given him my note and continued to talk to him. Glenn. If you're reading this. Your friend who still doesn't speak Spanish well fell in love with you a little bit. When I was about 7 years old, I visited the city with my uncle. He dropped me off at a bench with a snack while he tried to orient himself. He was close by but not right next to me. A homeless man sat on the opposite end of the bench. He was balding but had wisps of white hair. He wore eccentric and mix-matched clothes. I remember that he smelled but I wasn't bothered by it. He asked a question. Then answered it. Then asked another and answered it. He was so animated as he spoke to himself. I watched with curiosity. It dawned on me that he was interviewing himself. A wave of emotion rushed over me. Loneliness and sadness hit me strong in the gut. I wished someone else would ask him these questions. Why couldn't another person give him the attention he needs? I don't remember what he specifically said and I desperately wish I could. My uncle appeared and grabbed me. He said something along the lines of "Don't mind him. He's crazy." Another burst of pain hit me with his comment. He's a human that deserves equal respect. At this point, the most pure, unadulterated compassion that only a child could have filled me. Even now, it pains me that I forget what he looks like as the years go by. He's the reason I want to become a psychiatric nurse. I hope he's okay. I hope someone gave him some attention.